was once upon a time a princess, and her name was Honeybell, and she was lovely. Everybody thought so. The young bloods who longed for her, who were way below her league, the old men who ought to have known better, who ogled her from afar, even the flunkies and the footmen with their masks, faces, frozen masks, their eyes followed her as she went down the corridor. She was lovely. But no one thought she was lovelier than she did herself. And she would sit in her room, in her bedroom, with the great gilded mirror and stare at it for hours. And stare at her beauty and at her corn gold hair and at her bluebell blue eyes and at the skin soft. But even Princess Honeybell had to do something else sometimes. And she had her diversion, her ball, her golden ball. It was so beautiful. It was exquisite. It was like a teardrop of gold. And she could look at her ball in the palace and see her face reflected and all the palace around her. And she could take her ball out to the grounds. Those grounds with their long white gravel paths and their long rectangles of cut grass. And she loved to hear the crunch of her feet on the gravel and to roll that golden ball along the moss-soft grass. And on it went, and on among the circular pools and the statues and the fountain, until she got to the very end of the palace grounds. And at the very end of the palace grounds there was a wood, a copse. It was a tangle of holly and of brambles and of trees and of shrubs and of creepers and of wiry things, and it had one single path that wound into it. And when Princess Honeybell stepped into that path, her little heart beat a little faster. Pitter-patter, pitter-patter. But to soothe her, she took her golden ball and she passed it from one hand to another, and then tossed it in the tossed as the canopy closed about her, until quite suddenly she tossed a little too high, and the ball slipped out of her hand into the pool below. And she watched it sink through the clear waters on the surface, through the smoky middle of the pool, down to disappear in the murky depths. And she was horrified. She'd lost a precious ball. It was the most precious thing she had. Well, quite as precious as her clothes, or her shoes, or her jewels, but she didn't want to lose her ball. And while she was crying and while her sobs were echoing throughout the wood, she became aware of two eyes looking at her from the pool. Oh, a frog. Horrid. And the frog gazed at her for a while and then said to her, "And what's the matter with you?" And she was so upset about her ball that she didn't really take on board that a frog was talking to her. So she said, "I've lost my ball, it's so precious, it's fallen down in the bottom of the pond." And the frog said to her, "What will you give me if I retrieve your ball?" Jewels, gold, precious things. And the frog said to her, "Those are of no use to me at all. But," he said, "what you could be is my friend." Oh, it didn't seem too hard to be a friend. "You could be my friend and share with me the food of your plate and the wine of your glass. Oh, well, that was a little bit unorthodox, but she suddenly had a reality check. What was she doing here? Negotiating with a frog. What did that matter? So she said, okay, yeah, fine, food, wine, yeah. And, said the frog, share your bed. Oh, she thought, whatever. Food, wine, bed, yeah, okay, sure, fine. And then the frog said to her, and do you promise? Oh, she thought. She crossed her fingers behind her back. Yeah, I promise. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, sure. Down went the frog deep into the pool. And he returned in about a minute with the ball lodged between his head and his back. And the princess, who by now was kneeling at the edge of the pool, grabbed the ball. Great, she said, and turned and started to leave. Wait, said the frog, aren't you going to take me with you? Am I going to take you with me? No, I'm not. Bug eyes, she said, so why don't you frog off? And with that, she turned and skipped out of the wood, a little girlish trilling song coming from her mouth. And really, by the time tea time had arrived, she'd all but forgotten that frog. A memory, a distant fantasy, perhaps. And in any case, it was a formal dinner that night, and Honeybell loved formal dinners. There was going to be a new dress and a new coiffure. She was very excited, and walking into the great palace dining hall, she walked with her mother and father, the king and queen, and she knew that all the eyes of everyone in that court were on her. The men with lust, and the women with jealousy. It was just great. And they arrived at the dais up at the high table. The king and queen sat in the middle, and she sat a little to one side. And the chef came to the king's side and said, Majesty, for the first course we have a little soup. It is made of fish, I think you like it very much, with a rainbow of herbs and spices. Yes. The king, to be frank, would have preferred an honest brown Windsor. But his wife was French, and she brought the chef with her. It was part of the marriage settlement. So the soup was served, and Princess Honeybell dipped in her soup spoon, and oh, it was delicious. The bouquet just burst on her delicate young palate. But just then there was a great knocking on the outside door of the palace. Strange, this time. The king sent his footman to find out what it was. He soon returned, and he whispered in the king's ear, and the king frowned. And then the king looked at the footman, and then the king turned to look at his daughter. And then he said, Princess Honeybell. And the princess thought, oh dear, because she knew she was in trouble when Daddy used both names. He said, did you this morning converse in the copse with a frog? Well, sort of. And did you agree to share the food of your plate and the wine of your glass with the frog? I kind of did you promise. It was just a frog. Did you promise? Yes. Now, this was a king who would cheerfully send out his soldiers to batter or dismember or decapitate someone he didn't like, but he did insist that a promise was always honoured. And so he said, "Admit the frog." So the great doors at the end of the dining room opened and the frog slithered in. And step by step by step, he crossed the grey stone flagons of that floor until he arrived just below the princess's place. And then he said to the princess, "Pick me up." Well, the princess stood and she thought to herself how easy it would be as she stepped round the table just to crush the wretched beast beneath her foot. But Daddy was watching and he was rather cross. So she picked up the frog and she put it by the soup bowl, and the frog slithered onto the soup bowl and went, a soupçon of tarragon, I think. And then he took another slurp, and then he turned to the princess and said, "Aren't you having any?" And she said, "I've lost my appetite." Soon after that, the plates, the soup bowls were removed, and the chef once more came to the king's side and said, "Majesty, we have some lamb that I've cooked. It's very, very beautiful. Some d'agneau, and the pomme de terre dauphinoise, and how you say, le petit pois with the mint." And the king said, "Yes, yes, yes." And after he'd gone, the king leant to the chancellor, who was at his right, and said, "I'd rather just have boiled beef." But the meat was served, and instantly the frog climbed onto the plate and began to take a bite out of that lamb. "Ah," said the frog, "a point, and just a soupçon of garlic." And then he said, "How about a little wine?" And the princess had to call the servant who brought the saucer, and she poured in the wine, and the frog, mellow 54. Just an aftertaste of cherry blossom. "And now," said the frog, and the entire hall had fallen silent by this time, "and now, to bed." Well, the king visibly froze at this moment, and his jaw then dropped. And he turned very slowly to his daughter, and he said, "And did you promise that?" It was just a frog. "Did you promise?" "Yes." "Then you shall honor your promise. Go!" So the princess stood up, took the frog in her hand, looked at the distant door, it seemed like a very long way away, and started across the hall, her face burning scarlet. And as she walked, she knew that at one time or another she had dissed, reprimanded, rubbished, slagged off, told tales about everyone in that court, and she knew they were now delighted at her exquisite embarrassment. But she made it to that door, eventually came to the other side, leant against it with relief, and then climbed up the stone stairs to her room, the room with a fabulous view across the mountains. Not that she cared about that. And she took the frog to the most distant part of her bedroom and put it down, and then she retreated to the opposite wall, and frog and princess stared at each other for a long time. And eventually the frog said, "And now, strip!" She could not believe what she was hearing. How often had she imagined this moment, imagined her giving herself with love and passion, imagined a young man, handsome, improbably rich, certainly royal, a body that was rugged and muscular, and over that body, like a skin, an officer's uniform, and with the ardour of the moment, a comma of hair fallen over his forehead, broken away from the stern, masculine coiffure. And she imagined looking into his eyes and saying, "Oh yes, tenderness, and oh, the ardour here she was, in her bedroom, about to do it with a frog. Something within her exploded like lava from a volcano. She hurtled over to the frog on the other side of the room. She picked it up in her fair right arm and hurled it with all her strength against the wall. And as she did so, she imagined the frog hitting that wall, splat, bursting in like a bag of green gore and slithering down the wall. It didn't happen. There, just at the moment when the frog should have hit that wall, was a young man. A handsome young man. Possibly a very rich young man, surely royal, and yes, with a rugged and muscular body and like a skin over that torso, the officer's uniform of the hussars, with its gold buttons and epaulettes. And yes, there had broken from his so stern male coiffure a single comma of hair. She looked into his eyes. Oh, yes, there was tenderness and the ardour of lust. And he said to her, "Thank you, princess, for rescuing me. For he said I was cursed by a witch to be a frog these past months, and I had to be rescued by a fair maiden who would share with me the food of her plate, the wine of her glass, and her bed." And then he went up to the princess and he took her in his arms and he said, "Will you share your bed?" Yes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to draw a discreet storytelling curtain over that night of intimacy and passion. But the next morning, the prince leapt out of bed and was looking out of that window and called, "Heinrich!" And the princess, admiring his naked and ripped torso, heard from outside, "Yes, my lord!" And the prince turned to the princess and said, "That is my trusty servant, Heinrich, and he has kept the faith with me through all the months of my curse." And he said, "Now you and I will dress and go down to the carriage, and I will take you to my kingdom, where you will be married and eventually become my queen." And the princess said, "Shouldn't we talk to Mummy and Daddy first?" So they dressed and went downstairs. And I have to tell you that the king regarded their mutual story of how the frog that was taken to the room by his daughter was transformed at some late hour into this handsome young man with a degree of skepticism. But when he found that that young man owned all the land from the mountains to the sea, and all the hills and the valleys and the lakes and the rivers, and the villages and the towns and the cities, and the palaces and the castles, and the industrial estates, and the theme parks, he felt that he could believe any batty old fairy tale. And so it was soon after that the princess and the prince went into that carriage driven by Heinrich, who took them to their new world. And their life together was a delight, except for one tiny difference. The princess, for the rest of her life, couldn't really cope with any kind of spawn, tadpole, froglet, or frog. Whereas the prince, although he had experienced the rigours of that curse as a frog, had rather fond memories of floating in a deep pool with his head just above the surface, calm, clear, and with a sense of an affinity with all living things. And so he made it his business, and being king he could, to fill every ditch, pool, pond and lake with spawn, tadpoles, froglets and frogs of every hue. And this meant that wherever wherever he went in the kingdom, he was surrounded by the glorious cacophony of pirips. And that meant that he was always in touch with his inner frog. That's the end of my song.